Hey guys, welcome back to another Fundamentals Friday. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for the wonderful feedback on the previous video. Seems like most people seem to really enjoy it, and I've taken your suggestions into account because today's subject is going to be all about folds. Now, folds is a very fun subject, a very interesting one, because obviously it leans us closer to what I think most people are aiming for, and that's character design. Now, in this video, we're going to discuss a lot of basic principles on folds. But if you guys want to go more specifically into something like character design itself and how cloth would apply, then that's definitely a potential subject for a future video. But for now, let's see if we can simplify the intensity that is folds, because a lot of people are very intimidated by the complexity or the seeming complexity that folds tend to bring with them. In my experience, the thing that makes folds so daunting for a lot of students is the fact that they don't necessarily try to understand how the folds work. They try to understand how they need to look. So most people tend to learn in a very visual way. They'll look at a reference and they'll maybe scour the internet for the exact cloth reference that they need to put into their drawing. Now that's a fairly unproductive way of going about it, because that just makes you dependent on your own references and makes it much more difficult to transition from something, let's say, that is a bit more realistic to something that you perhaps want to create that's a bit more stylized. So once we start actually moving into the more creative side of things and we want to start creating cloth from imagination for example, stylized projects, we need to start learning more about how to understand folds and how they actually come into being. So it's more so about understanding the way, like, even the real world works, like physics influence our cloth, basically. Now, in order to understand folds, there's a couple of general ideas that we want to focus on. And the first idea is going to be the differentiation between tension and compression. Tension is mostly, you know, the cloth is, for example, hanging on a single thread on a wire. You're holding it yourself and the cloth is hanging down. That's creating tension between point A and point B. So, for example, I have my sweater. Well, of course, if it's pulling apart, like, that's going to create tension. But even just passively, my sweater hanging from my shoulders also tension. But on the opposite side, we have compression, and compression is more so about like folds or cloth collapsing in on itself. So you can see some examples right here on my sleeve. For example, on my elbow, you have all of the cloth kind of collapsing in on itself. It's pushing against itself. There's no tension here. The cloth is actually quite relaxed. While if I straighten my arm and I pull on it, that's creating tension, and you see immediately a different kind of fold emerges. So the differentiation between tension and compression, keep that in mind, because that's going to be important throughout the rest of this video. Now, what do we need to know as well? We need to understand tension points and what role they play in the creation of folds. Now, tension points, as you can imagine, are mostly related to the tension itself, right? But the tension point is where an external force is applied to our cloth that isn't gravity. So again, you holding up your cloth, maybe the wind blowing against it, maybe it hanging down from a wire. So it is something interacting with your cloth, applying tension to that cloth. It usually counteracts the gravity as well, which makes it a bit more easy to identify. Now, there's a couple of standard fold types that we can use to identify basically anything that we want to create. And many different people have covered folds already on YouTube. I'm aware of this. All of them probably have similar sets of folds, but also they tend to deviate a little bit. So I'm just going to provide you with the core folds that, in my opinion, can be used to branch out. And basically they are going to be the foundation, and whenever you have a fold that maybe doesn't line up with any of these four, it's probably just going to be a variation of these four types. Now, the first one is going to be the drop folds and the pipe folds, and we're going to cover them right away. The pipe folds are, well, it's kind of in the name. You can see kind of how they would work. It's these pipes, these round tubes tend to form in cloth, especially when they're hanging down. Now, an interesting thing to note is this is probably the simplest fold that we can create, because there's only one tension point, really applying that external force, that counter force, basically, to our piece of cloth. And another different interesting thing to note is that the edges of these pieces of cloth need to remain the same. So for example, in this case, I have point A and point B and point C, right? So point A and point B, the difference between point A and point B over here needs to be the same as the one over here, because it's not the cloth that's lengthening, it's just point B is moving positions because that isn't being held by an external force. There's no tension point holding point B. So that's going to drop down into that area where it is right now, but that length of that edge is going to have to be the same. Same thing with point A and point C, like that's still going to be the same, but also point B and point C. So the distance between this line is going to somehow be the same as the difference between these lines. Now obviously that can be the case if we just use a straight line, which is why the pipe folds tend to be created, because in order to keep that same distance alive, we need to start circling around ourselves, and we start creating a longer line just by compressing, again, compression, by compressing these 2 points together so that we can still keep the same length that we had in our just flat sheet of cloth. So that's a fairly simple idea, and this is again the most simple way to apply that idea. And as you can see, just by me having it sketched out here, this is sort of how it works. So the length of the planes, or of the edges, I mean, need to remain the same. It's just the cloth collapsing in on itself towards where gravity is pulling down on it, right? So that's our first type of fold, the pipe fold. We can now move on to the second one, which is the diaper fold. And the diaper fold, well, let's actually keep the pipe fold just next to it for reference. So the diaper fold is another fairly simple one, a fairly common one that we'll see. Like you'll see this, for example, in capes and hoods, perhaps like again, even a shirt. Like it's hard to see with my sweater right now, but between your shoulders, you are creating, there we go, these diaper folds as well, because they are tension points, and like right in between in the middle, that's where those folds tend to converge. So the same idea applies, except now we're using 2 tension points. So imagine I'm grabbing this cloth and I'm moving these corners slightly closer together. Of course, we all know the cloth will tend to sag. Interesting thing to note in this case, and I didn't measure this out like precisely, but the distance again between point A and point B, once again, needs to be the same length as our original point A and point B. So that means the length that we need to drop down is actually the length that we're moving inwards. So there's already there something to keep in mind, you know, like we need to understand how much our cloth is going to deform based on what we do with it. And by converging those 2 points, by bringing them closer together, suddenly you get these, again, these V shapes, these diaper shapes in a sense, that starts going downwards until, of course, we get towards our corners where the folds can no longer merge. So what's going to happen here is we can also see that the distance between these creases increasingly gets longer and longer as we go further and further away from those tension points. That's because closer to these tension points, we're going to have much more detail in the kind of fine folds and the fine creases that we're going to see, and further down, like at that point, they've sort of faded out and they need to merge with the rest of the cloth. So it's a fairly simple one to understand as well, but the main thing that makes this one interesting is when we actually start shifting the position of these 2 tension points. So A has now shifted downwards in this case, for example, and the thing we notice is with this diaper fold, the cloth actually has shifted to the left slightly, like the dip has gotten closer towards our lowest tension point. And anyone who's sort of helped carrying something heavy up a staircase, you'll probably know who needs to like exert himself the most, who needs to lift the most force, because it's always the one at the bottom that's carrying most of the weight. The one at the top needs to carry less weight. So you can keep that in mind when you're thinking about these folds. But also it would just kind of look weird if we do it the opposite way. That would probably just feel a little bit off. So again, the dip, the lowest point of our diaper fold, is going to be closer to our lowest tension point as well. And this is something you can very easily see happen, for example, in something like a toga, maybe even, you know, just like any kind of sash that you're wearing on one shoulder, really. Another important thing to keep in mind is these folds are also three-dimensional. So that means we're gonna get a very specific sort of cross-section where the folds go outwards and inwards again, and then outwards again and inwards again. So it's not a two-dimensional shape, it's a three-dimensional form, and that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. Again, just a little bit of a graph to kind of explain how this works. So the distance between these edges needs to remain the same, and that's the main thing that we want to keep in mind. Yeah, again, the central point of the dip is also going to shift towards the lowest tension point. Next in the list, we have one that's probably the most complicated to draw for most people. It's going to be the zigzag folds. And the zigzag folds, I quite like them. I think they're very, like they add a lot of character basically to your drawing. You have a lot of different options on how you can actually design them almost. So these ones allow for a lot of creative freedom. Maybe because they're more difficult to understand, there's a larger margin of error, so they don't look like they're wrong as quickly as the other ones would. But the thing to keep in mind in this case is what creates the zigzag. Now a zigzag fold is basically when we have compression combined with tension. So we have one tension point at the top, and then we have a surface at the bottom kind of pushing upwards. So again, we can imagine like these examples over here, like a foot pushing up against the lower part of a pant leg. Maybe your belly pushing up against the lower part of a sweater, right? Those kind of areas, that's where we would see those diaper folds, zigzag folds, I mean. And in this case, it's easier to start by understanding how it would work if we do it two-dimensionally. So again, imagine we've lifted up at the ground and it's pushing up against this cloth. And suddenly we start seeing these zigzags appear, and they get more and more close together the closer they get towards the floor in this case, because that's where the compression is highest. This is where there's still a little bit of tension, right? And you'll see this happen when you would take a towel and kind of slowly lift it and slowly lower it to the ground. You'll see automatically sort of the fold start kind of curving up on itself until it starts straightening out again. Now, the way this works on a three-dimensional form is we need to keep in mind that, like for example, the leg of a pant, that's going to be a cylindrical piece of cloth that we're going to lower down. So that zigzag that we see over here is now gonna trace along that surface really. And of course, by doing that, we also need to kind of make sure that that's able to happen like on all of the sides. So instead of now just kind of creating that two-dimensional zigzag, we are basically creating a three-dimensional, almost like a rotation of the lower plane, where we can see these kind of creases tend to form. And you can sort of map them out almost with these triangles that are sort of intersecting in a way where we still allow a path like a zigzag to cross through. An easy way to kind of get these kind of folds straight away is we can just start with a line that's fairly long at the top, and again the compression starts piling up, and the closer we get towards the bottom, the more narrow the fold is going to get. And that is our starting point of our folds. Now we just need to figure out how that would look if we would do it from the side, and that's basically how we can start really coming up with these zigzag folds. So it's quite a fun little process, but we do need to figure out how exactly the compression would affect that zigzag. And in this case, usually what you can see is there's going to be compression on one side, and as a consequence, there's going to be a little bit of a stretch on the other side. So one side of your cloth is mostly going to be fairly detailed with a lot of different creases and bumps, while the other side is probably going to be a little bit more simplistic. But that's again our just foundation that we want to use for our zigzag folds. We already have 3 different types of folds, and you can already see how these 3 really allow for a lot of variation in your work. So let's move on to the final one that we're going to discuss, and that's going to be the zigzag fold, the spiral fold in this case. So the spiral fold, is another one where we're working with tension, but in this case, it's tension through rotation in a sense. So we have our tension point now not necessarily just moving apart from each other, but kind of moving around a form. And this is something you'll very often see like around your pants, like you can see over here. So the outside of my knee would be creating a tension point, and the crotch where like maybe even all the way on the other leg is creating a tension point, and these are moving away from each other around that surface of our leg, which means they're going to create these sort of spiral shaped folds that tend to converge to the same point. But since the outside of the leg, for example, isn't a single point necessarily, it's going to be like more so an area where these folds are going to try to converge. So that's kind of what happens. And this can happen not only with, you know, just tense cloth, but also if I have zigzag fold and I want to add a little bit of rotation to that, like that zigzag is now going to have to transform into that spiral fold. And since we have a bit of spare cloth left, it's going to be much more loose than the very tight, tiny creases that we're going to see on the more tight surface. But that's mostly what applies on stuff like sleeves, even you know, a tight shirt. Like whenever basically you have a rotation happening, like again you can see it in my sweater already. Like if I lift up, for example, my thumb, you can see these creases kind of spiraling again around my arm, going from my armpit where I have a tension point because that's where it's pulling, to my thumb where I have a tension point because that's where it's pulling, and maybe the entire upper side of my arm is acting as somewhat of a tension point, and therefore we're getting to that point where we have these spirals happening. So there's a lot of different things happening at the same time with cloth, but it should definitely help us get a bit more of a clear understanding on how to create cloth from imagination just with these couple simple ideas. So a very fun exercise you can try out to improve your logical reasoning of creating folds is actually by just drawing a bunch of very simple basic building blocks. Like we just need a couple of fundamental like three-dimensional forms that we want to basically start dressing up, not necessarily with clothes, but just kind of by throwing a tarp over top and seeing what happens. So you can imagine like these very simple forms like a cube, a cylinder, and anything that kind of expands upon that. They alone will allow you to play around with like how the different folds will interact. The cube is a very interesting example, first of all, because we have 5 different tension points in this case, and because the cube is slightly tilted, we'll see a lot of diaper folds form between the corners that eventually end up making their way towards the bottom, where we'll end up with those pipe folds or those drop folds. The cylinder, the same idea, but now because it's not a corner, but a larger edge, we can actually see the same thing happening, but in this case we need to consider the entire edge of the cylinder basically as one large tension point. So there's going to be a lot more intricate folds in there. So whenever you have two things poking out, two things pointing, you have these diaper folds forming in between, and you just kind of need to figure out how they would logically transition from those diaper folds into those pipe folds, or perhaps whenever you have identified where the tension and the compression is, they might even transition into stuff like zigzag folds, or again those spiral folds. So with the spiral folds we can see with the cylinder, for example, where it's wrapping around the form. But aside from that, you know, see how you can figure out how these transitions actually work. Obviously you can use reference to see how it would actually act in real life. Like a fun exercise you can do as well is just grab a blanket to yourself, throw it over something that you have in your house, and see if you can figure out how to sketch that and try to identify those particular types of folds, because that's really going to help you create a little bit of a visual library and a lot more insight into how the folds are forming, and how we can then again move on to those more intricately shaped designed folds, let's say. The next challenge is going to be to start applying these folds that we've now learned of to our characters, obviously. And again, going back to the idea that students tend to focus too much on the two-dimensional side of things and how things would look based on the reference, really getting into understanding the three-dimensional form of the thing you're trying to cloth is going to be crucial into understanding which folds will belong on which part of your character. So in this case, for example, we have a simple mannequin. We can very clearly identify what's coming towards the camera, what's going away from the camera. Like the three-dimensional depth is very easy to interpret suddenly. And that's going to allow us to draw conclusions like, oh yeah, so this is where the cloth is going to be compressing. This is where the cloth is going to have a lot of tension. So it's going to be draping off of the head towards the shoulder. It's going to draping off of the shoulder towards the elbow, where it's going to be pushing up and creating a zigzag fold. So again, figuring out, A, do I have a tension point? B, how many tension points? And C, is there compression happening with these folds, will help you very clearly navigate between the different types of folds and when it's appropriate to use which one. So now that we actually know how to draw these folds and how to understand these folds, we're gonna start applying them to, I believe, what all of you guys actually clicked on this video for, and that is how do I actually start clothing my characters? Because character design, let's be honest, is one of the most fun things to do as an artist. Usually people tend to start out drawing characters when they're quite young, and folds are just a thing that makes your characters feel much more believable, much more interesting to look at. So we can use this understanding, this newfound understanding from this video perhaps, to try to work our way through how the logics of something as simple as a t-shirt works. So a t-shirt, for example, fairly easy to interpret. We have 2 tension points on the shoulders, and we have a diaper fold in between that's going to make its way downwards. When we go all the way to the waist, that's where we end up with very wide pipe folds. The shoulders as well, from the shoulders down, the cloth tends to fall downwards into just a simple pipe fold and perhaps maybe a bit of a spiral fold depending on the positioning of the arm. So very simple to work with, nothing too complicated, at least in a resting position. Of course, when we start moving, external forces apply and it becomes a bit more complicated as well. With the sweater, we can already see something very different happen, because the sweater has much more thick material, a much more solid material, which means the folds are going to be much more clunky. We're still going to have that diaper fold in between, but because of the thickness of the cloth in that case, we'll end up with much wider diaper folds on the shirt. Because there's more cloth to work with, we're also going to end up with larger diaper folds, larger zigzag folds, I mean. And the material itself, the silhouette is going to be deviating quite a lot from just the silhouette of a human torso. If you then move on to our female figure, it's quite fun to, by the way, just sketch these mannequins and figure out different ways to dress them up, because you can just copy paste them a couple of times, throw a bunch of different outfits on there, and that's probably the next exercise, the exercise that I would recommend you guys try out. After, of course, you've started to understand how the folds work and how the three-dimensional form works. So again, the t-shirt we can see works in a fairly similar way. Pants, depending on how tight or how loose they are, they might be very baggy in this case, so we can actually work with quite large, clunky folds once again, wherever the cloth starts bunching up. Now, something that I won't address in this video, because it's a whole subject perhaps for a future Fundamentals Friday, is going to be closer related to costume design, and that's going to be the material that we're working with. Again, a silk versus a leather, or a leather versus a jeans, that's going to be immensely different in how the folds are actually going to interact with physics, really. But let me know if you guys would find it interesting to dive a bit deeper into that side of like character design, the costume designing part, and how outfits would logically be put together, because it does help with, again, understanding how the folds are going to flow. Like, for example, where the seam on the shoulder would be, whether it's lower down or higher up, also is going to affect quite heavily how the folds are eventually going to look. In this next character, we have the opposite silhouette, because obviously the clothes themselves serve as a very strong foundation for creating more interesting silhouettes for your characters. And something I like to play with is the waistline. So lifting the waistline, lowering the waistline, so high-waisted pants versus low-waisted pants, a shirt that's tucked in versus a very loose, oversized shirt. In this case, the shirt itself quite loose, but tucked into the pants. The pants themselves, quite a strict, straight fabric, so it's going to go straight down. And again, we can see a lot of the folds reappear. We sort of have the spiral folds around the shoulders, and the pants are actually just one large pipe fold, so to speak. So it does become quite easily digestible the more you get familiarized with these different kind of folds and how they would interact with your form once again. Now obviously a character design usually is going to be in a similar pose like this, where we have fairly standard neutral poses that we can then start dressing up in different ways. So we usually don't really have too crazy folds to think of. It's mainly, again, our pipe fold, diaper fold, zigzag fold, and spiral fold. Now, as a final example, I personally really like it when outfits are a little bit more clunky, a little bit more bulky. So a winter coat, for example, is actually quite an interesting subject to try out, because again, the fabric is very, very different. But now we're really working with not necessarily sticking to the silhouette of the character, but we can build up layers and we can create these very large shapes that become interesting to look at and can really shape the look of our character. And I think when people dress up their characters, they tend to stick too much to the silhouette of the anatomy. But in this case, for example, the anatomy is completely hidden. It's kind of the same with growing hair. Like, it's not something that is skin tight, it's something that has its own volume that is going around the volume of the body itself. And we can actually just slowly construct that volume up, figure out where those folds are going to be. And again, because of the thickness of the jacket, the folds are going to be much more pronounced, not so subtle, and it's going to end up creating a very interesting looking character in the end. So I do hope that all makes sense. If you have any suggestions that you'd like me to explain in a future Fundamentals Friday, feel free to let me know, and I'd happily have a look at that. Alright, so if there's anything at all that you feel like was left unsaid or that you want to know more about, feel free to once again leave a suggestion in the comment section. I do read through most of them, and I do want to keep into account what you guys are asking for. So that's my main way of having an idea of what the next subject is going to be. As suggested, or as I suggested, I'd like to perhaps elaborate onto what we've learned today, but specifically more towards characters. But in the meantime, feel free to check out the Brush Sauce website to see if you find anything that might fill in the gaps, that might give you a little bit of extra information, because there's a lot of content on there and there's so much still to learn. But for now, let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe I'll catch you at the future Fundamentals Friday. Take care.